also doing
Yeah, well, I have. I gotta really revise it because basically,
so I guess it'll depend on whether I'm doing like refugee or asylum.
yeah, that's what I'm gonna do.
I mean that even in and of itself, that's specific enough that I feel like I'm kind of pretty good. But still, like it's a very broad environment, which I also like. There's so many. Cause that's the other thing.
Yeah, Sam calls them.
Oh, okay. Okay, because I did one yesterday and I got like really wrapped up in it and then I had to leave and then there were like 2 more calls after I left.
So I was at.
Were they you guys together? Mondays?
Yeah.
Were the Tuesday?
With Sam team. Sam took the ones that I didn't do at 4 p.m. They called between 4 and 5 and I was...
It was for immigration and labor. So it was like
What about the meeting?
attorneys need to go.
So she was supposed to come with her husband because her husband
It was really neat. They
so I talked to her for like 2 minutes and then rescheduled.
You had it in perspective and right? Friday? Because I heard her like spilling bad outside. And I know that place. That's in Venezuela.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Oh yeah, exactly.
I'm working on another issue. I'm sure myself was really when I review my
Yeah, we were struggling with the interpreter. Why? I don't know. He just like wasn't like because she would talk and then she would like pause. To give
Because
him,
it was a quality.
yeah, but she would pause to give him time to interpret, and then he just like wouldn't speak. So then she would like keep talking, and then he'd be like, "No, wait, like I'm trying to translate what you're saying," and I'm like, "No, this needs to be like a fluid conversation."
Yeah, exactly. Did you change your interpreter? No.
She made it.
Are you gonna take it?
No. The first requirement is that you have experience working in
Governor.
I also
His name.
Last name Perez. He was in like 2000.
did that on Friday, which is a bunch of
Yeah.
Following the situation in Venezuela. That's why every time I say interpreter, like, you can let me know.
Yeah, so I guess that was like a year before. He ended in 2012.
I was going to go to that.
Chavez died in
It was like on a Thursday after it was like the second week of class, right?
Yeah, and then
This is like a super atomic. It's actually I'm writing my independent.
I remember that.
no. I'm gonna
You gotta be exhausted. Oh, are you guys certain that it was a notice? Yeah. Oh,
yeah. So I
that was the guy behind the but he decided to for that specific.
Well, I'm just like that's the thing for me.
Oh, my phone is hitting that.
I didn't
Like, you know, when Apple
slow it down.
ruins everything, and like certain apps are like, oh, we can't upgrade on this, whatever. I'm like, no, I don't want a new phone.
So have you guys been
Apple.
It is a different.
They do something to the old.
Yours was being slower, right?
That's what happens to like mine. I have to change it, and I
Look,
think
we're doing the thing that they were like shutting the batteries off at like 90% or whatever.
I was like,
complete it. Like,
yeah.
that's how
We
they
haven't
do
even
it.
touched it.
But that's why I don't like doing the updates.
Yeah.
They are doing it.
Good afternoon.
Little sections, I like that.
It's wonderful to see you and for all of you to be here. Welcome to this event. As indicated and as advertised, we are going to have a discussion on the enforcement of immigration laws in the United States. And we're actually talking about many components and dimensions of the contemporary application of immigration law in the United States and many challenges. As many of you know, we're talking about recent developments. We're talking about the current legal and policy context, continuing concerns, but we're also talking a little bit about the future as well. As most of you know, my name is Rosa Celorio. I'm the Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at the Law School, and I'll be moderating this panel. And it's really my honor to welcome our distinguished panelists today who are very, very experienced and well-known practitioners in the realm of immigration law. We have Michelle Branet, who's the Director of the Migrant Rights and Justice Program of the Women's Refugee Commission. We have Royce Murray, who's the Policy Director of the American Immigration Council. We have our own Professor Alberto Benitez, who's the Director of the Immigration Law Clinic. And we also have Paulina Vera, who's actually a supervisory attorney at our Immigration Law Clinic as well. And I just wanted to tell you that our panelists are going to be focusing on a number of different issues that are really contemporary and interesting to discuss at this particular stage in time. I mean, one of them is how the current moment and the current tendencies fit the history of immigration law in the United States, its application and also its enforcement. They're also going to be discussing a lot of recent matters that have attracted significant media attention, like family separation, like detention policies, like the Trump plans to increase not only mistreatment of immigrants seeking public assistance, but other measures as well that we have concerns about. And they're going to be focusing on legal, policy, and human implications. But I think one of the interesting things that this panel is going to discuss is not only how many of these issues have domestic law repercussions, but also international law repercussions, and also have a special affectation on specific groups in a situation of vulnerability, like women and children and others. I just wanted to share a personal note before I turn the microphone to our panelists. I'm actually the daughter of an immigrant. I'm the daughter of a Cuban immigrant, and I actually grew up with a lot of immigration stories. And I remember my father, who was Cuban, and he fled a very repressive regime to come to the United States. And for him, the United States was the land of hope, of freedom, of potential. It was a land where he was able to rebuild his life and something that he really treasured as an immigrant. And observing and following the current news and everything that has been happening on immigration recently, at least it has greatly concerned me and really questioned what the United States is about when it comes to immigration law and its application. Thank you all for being here. I really find wonderful to have so much student interest and faculty interest in these events. And without further ado, I wanted to begin this panel by passing the microphone to Professor Benitez.
Thank you, Dean Celorio, and thank you to my distinguished panel members. I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, certainly more than whatever I have to say here. Those of you who work with me know that I like to start with a punchline to get to the point. And the punchline to whatever I'm going to say here today is that we can start fixing whatever needs to be fixed in 34 days. I checked before I came over here. It's 34 days till Election Day. So register to vote and make sure whoever you know that can vote has arrived that day and where your precinct is and so on and so forth. Because that really is going to be the first step to fixing many things that we're going to be talking about today. I took advantage of my of the kindness of Dean Savorio to say that I'd like to talk about history a little bit, my history, because the title of this wonderful panel includes "Where is the U.S. heading?" And I'm not quite sure we can know where the U.S. is heading if we don't know where the U.S. has come from or where the United States has been. So I want to use as the centerpiece of my 10 minutes a quote from June 16th, 2015. And the quote is as follows. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. You probably know who made that statement. And if you don't, I'll tell you. It's the current president of the United States. I take that, and I take immigration law very personally, because to me, immigration law is what I do. It's what I use to pay my mortgage and support my spouse and my dog in the manner in which they become accustomed. But to me, it's way more than that. To me, it's who I am and the people that I grew up with, not only my family, but my immediate friends. I grew up in that hotbed of Mexican immigration, which is Buffalo, New York. I say that ironically. But back in the day, Bethlehem steel was booming. My father was a steel worker. He came to the United States with a sixth-grade education, I think my mother. And now here I am, all of you lovely people listening to me talk about whatever it is I'm talking about. I share that quote because those of us who are either ourselves immigrants or the children of immigrants know that these words and these sentiments are not new. This man is not, he is not the one who initiated these thoughts and these comments and these statements. Anyone who is familiar with the U.S. history knows that it goes way, way back into the history of the United States. I can safely say I am the oldest person in this room by a lot. So I'm going to start by telling you that my connection to immigration law was always on a personal level just who we were. I never really thought about being the son of immigrants. It's just who we were. It wasn't until the year 1984, after my first year of law school, that I became acquainted with this thing known as immigration law. I knew that my parents had this card that they had a show when they came back into the United States, but like most people when we were young, we never asked our parents anything. And if your parents were like my parents, they never answered any questions because we had no reason or any need to know anything beyond what was right in front of us. But in 1984, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and I always attribute Ronald Reagan to the fact that I'm now an immigration attorney. Because I learned that in 1984 and the 80s, Ronald Reagan's Department of Justice was inoculating or injecting its political views into the asylum process. And if you know the history of the 1980s, there were wars going on in Central America. And that meant that certain nationalities were being granted asylum and other nationalities were not being granted asylum. Some things really never changed. So then I learned about this thing of immigration and asylum and how is it all together. And I learned that the Reagan administration and the Bush 1 administration and the Clinton administration and the Bush 2 and then the Obama administration actually did things that I disagreed with and continue to disagree with. But they all did something or some things that I agree with. For example, Ronald Reagan injected his politics into the asylum decision-making, but also in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed a huge legalization by which millions of people who were out of status were able to become lawful in the United States. How a conservative Republican president did that is something that makes a lot of people think. 10 years later, when a progressive Democrat, Bill Clinton, was president, he signed a very restrictive immigration bill, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. So it makes your head kind of spin when sort of political views are turned upside down. President Bush II did try to enact immigration reform. And I remember marching over on the Mall for immigration reform. And I remember for many reasons, including one of which, I stepped in a hole and twisted my ankle as I was marching. So I literally gave my ankle for immigration reform. But my ankle got better. Immigration reform did not get better because it didn't happen. And then President Obama enacted DACA and enacted DAPA. One worked, the other one got stopped pretty quickly. But he also developed the reputation of being the deporter-in-chief, which I'm not quite sure is fair or accurate. But again, everybody, all of these presidents, at least in my memory, as a law student or as a lawyer, who did things that I think were good and bad. Now we reach the current administration. I ever see nothing like this. This stands alone because it seems like the central premise of this administration is to harm non-citizens, almost in a gleeful manner. And what I find is intriguing from a legal perspective is that the law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, has not changed since January 20th, 2017. There have been no amendments to the law. It's how the law has been applied. Why is this something that I wanted to share with you? The sentiment that is driving what this administration is doing goes back many, many years. What's different now is that the people who have those sentiments now actually control the reins of government. They can decide when families stay together and when families get broken up. They can decide that, for example, immigration judges are now going to be facing strict quota of getting cases in, getting out, getting in and out. Churn these cases up. We're going to put numerical quotas on the sorts of things that you're doing. And that's something that is unprecedented. Even in the Ronald Reagan and George Bush administration, which have the reputation of being conservative Republican administrations, I never encountered anything like this. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, the solution starts in 34 days. In 34 days, we all have the opportunity to vote either to continue the policies, if you happen to believe in those policies, or to start changing those policies. What I'd like to add to end this particular, my comments, is that there's a second thing that we can do, and that is continue to fight, to never give up. Ultimately, we will all be here, you will all be here, wherever you may be, fighting the good fight when this administration becomes history. It becomes an asterisk. But now things may look difficult, things may look gloomy, but ultimately I do believe this, that people of good faith and goodwill will win out. There's going to be a lot of suffering before that happens, but we can continue and we need to continue to fight on behalf of people who, for the time being, cannot fight on their own behalf. So thank you all. Look forward to everyone's comments and then questions.
Not sure if I'll need the mic, but I'm happy to use it in case that helps. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Royce Murray. I'm the Director of Policy and Media at the American Immigration Council. We're a DC-based nonprofit organization that, through litigation and getting good facts into the debate through our research and publications, that we're trying to fight for the United States to remain a welcoming country and to ensure that all are treated fairly, immigrants included. I wanted to build off of some of your remarks because, you know, I was actually, the quote from candidate Trump that you read, you know, I've heard a million times, and I have often focused on the part about, you know, they're rapists, they're murderers, and the criminality aspect. And I actually, for the first time, just caught another part of that, which was they're not sending you. And I thought that was very poignant. I missed that in the kind of inflammatory rhetoric around it. And it's really emblematic of the othering that this administration has done. And they haven't done it through legislation, as you said. They've done it through executive order. They're doing it through, or trying to do it through regulations, through guidance, through operational changes. There's a great deal of discretion in the way that the immigration laws are administered. And there are a lot of very savvy people, sophisticated immigration lawyers in key positions of this administration to understand how to use the existing frameworks to a different end. So, I mean, in the beginning of the administration, we definitely saw, what I've referred to as sort of the big shiny objects, the executive orders on things like the Muslim ban or the travel ban, and the refugee ban, which has unwound some to effectively become just, record low refugee admission levels and goals for the refugee program. We've seen DACA terminated by the administration and only kept on life support by the immigration courts. And we've seen temporary protected status, which is a status provided to about 325,000 people whose country is undergoing some form of conflict or environmental disaster or other extreme conditions. Nearly all of those designations have been terminated in the last year and a half, and they're unwinding now so that there are over 300,000 people who are losing their status and will suddenly be facing the risk of deportation for the first time in many years. We're also seeing on the enforcement front the elimination of enforcement priorities. So anyone who is out of status, either that they arrived undocumented, they overstayed, or they violated their status in some way, is at risk of enforcement, rather than a tiered set of enforcement priorities that existed under the Obama administration. And that's resulted in more non-criminals getting picked up, more long-time residents being placed in immigration court. And as a result, we're seeing the immigration courts backlogged. We're at record backlogs now with over 700,000 cases in the immigration court system. And it's almost as if they're trying to break the system. You mentioned the attacks on courts and trying to rush through those cases because they now have created this huge backlog, so they need to tackle it. But the way they want to do it is to rush through the cases rather than provide due process. Of course, none of those cases are people entitled to a government-provided lawyer, even though they have opposing counsel in each and every case before they go before the immigration judge. There are also very benign changes at the agency level. USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, is changing the way they do some of their adjudications. They've changed their policy to require more denials, or at least notices of intent to deny, rather than requesting more evidence to allow people more time to make their case. They're jumping straight into a denial process. They are also just implementing, as of this week, a new procedure to put more people who are denied benefits into the immigration court process, to subject them to charging documents. Basically, it's called a notice to appear, so that, again, they are putting more people into the enforcement process. And, whereas the first year of the administration was focused on a lot of those big picture objectives through the executive orders, this, is now shifted to the operational changes and regulatory changes. I think Michelle will likely talk a bit about the Flores regulations, so I did want to mention the public charge regulations, and these are the sort of two biggest ones right now. The public charge regulation actually is not officially published yet. It's the irony of the way that immigration matters are handled now. The press got a hold of what is to be the final version, and so DHS published it on its website, which is not actually the official way you promulgate regulations. You're supposed to publish them in the Federal Register, and so it's not actually official until it's in the Federal Register. These are proposed changes. There will be an opportunity for public comment. The agency will have to consider those comments and then publish a final rule. So these don't take effect yet. But the public charge rule is, dates back 125 years, where there's always been some provision where we look at someone's ability to provide for themselves and support themselves when we consider them for admission to the country, or whether we deport them based on them not being able to support themselves. As a practical matter, and there's a lot of history we could go into, but in the interest of time, at this point, the way public charge operates is, for the most part, you have to be primarily dependent on public benefits. in order to trigger this public charge ground. And if you have a sponsor who can provide an affidavit that they will support you if you need help, then that usually overcomes any of those triggers. The proposal, however, looks instead of a standard of primarily dependent, it says if you use any benefits basically at any time. And it goes on to list out which benefits exactly trigger it, but it broadens the list of benefits that people can use to trigger being a public charge. And it really minimizes the role of the sponsor. So you're limited in the ways you can overcome it. And as a practical matter, what this is expected to do is make it much harder for a lot of families to reunify. If they have family members abroad who they've petitioned for, unless you are wealthy at the start, we no longer see your potential. I mean, that's really the message here. It is harder for people without, it will be harder if this rule becomes final for people without resources to reunite with their family, to be brought over here, or to get a green card once they are already here. And that is by design. I mean, there's no mistaking the objective here. The expected effect of this regulation is to really have a chilling effect on the use of public benefits, things like food stamps, health benefits, SSI, disability benefits, things that, for right now, undocumented immigrants are not allowed to use most of these benefits. So this is not about the reality. This is about sending a message that immigrants are takers and that only certain kind of immigrants are welcome. And that message should not be missed. Finally, and this will sort of carry over, I think, into Michelle's remarks, there has been a very calculated attack on asylum seekers. That may be my most obvious remark of the day. Asylum seekers have been maligned from day one as loopholes, as people trying to take advantage of a system, as people who say magic words so that they can get in the door. We have turned them away at the border in ways that have been well documented. The council and other groups have existing litigation on this point because it is legal to seek asylum. So you can't the Border Patrol can't turn people away at the border and tell them that the U.S. isn't open for asylum anymore to Central Americans, or the beds are full, or we're under a new administration now, which are all things that have been said to asylum seekers. And turning them away at the border is not legal, and again, is a subject of litigation. When people get turned away at the border, at a port of entry, what they're doing instead is trying to enter between the ports of entry, because these are people who are fleeing violence and are seeking protection, and then we're turning around and prosecuting them for not using the port of entry. And I believe, Michelle will get into that further. Then if they've run that gauntlet, we detain them in greater numbers. Where there are more adults in immigration detention right now than ever before, at nearly 45,000 adults, and more children in immigration custody, at nearly 14,000 children. These are record high numbers for both populations. And then finally, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has taken it upon himself to use his authority to certify cases to himself. So when cases work their way up through the immigration court system, the Board of Immigration Appeals above that, the Attorney General has authority to then basically certify cases to himself, to revisit them, and has done this in the case of matter of AB, to effectively say, or I should say effectively, he actually says in the opinion, that as a general matter, asylum claims based on domestic violence or gang violence will not satisfy the requirements for asylum. And it's almost so categorically problematic, I don't know where to begin on the critique, other than asylum cases are supposed to be considered on a case-by-case basis, and to make those sort of categorical remarks is very legally questionable. This is still a new decision from the spring, so we're observing to see how it's applied. It's an interpretation of whether someone can establish persecution on account of a particular social group, and he's effectively saying that these grounds don't qualify as a particular social group. And so the asylum officers are applying this guidance, the immigration courts are applying this guidance, and it is seriously problematic because we're at risk of sending people back to harm's way. And on that note, happy note, I don't give a lot of happy talks these days, but I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you. I don't give a lot of... I don't give a lot of happy talks these days either, but I'll try to inject some wins in there. Sort of going off the initial theme that both of my colleagues here started with. This administration, I think a difference in how we're seeing the implementation and the policy rollout by this administration really is in a fundamental approach, right? So it's not just, it's very fundamentally this othering and the things you've heard. But, even in previous administrations, and the Women's Refugee Commission, I'm going to back up. Women's Refugee Commission is a nonprofit that focuses on protecting the rights and advocating on behalf of women, children, and youth who are displaced for various reasons. And we work around the world, mostly in the humanitarian context. But my program is the Migrant Rights and Justice Program. We focus primarily, although not exclusively, in the U.S. Our real focus is the human rights legal side of the right to protection and access to protection. We do our work through what we kind of describe as research, rethink, resolve, our tagline, which means we research issues. So we go out into the field. In my case, it's usually monitoring of what's going on, but we speak to affected populations, to women, children, youth, migrant men as well, legal service providers who are working with people, communities, border officials and government officials, and try to identify where the problem is, what are the gaps, what is happening, and that's sort of the research piece of it. And then we really focus on rethinking the situation to come up with solutions, reasonable, practical solutions. We have our loftier goals that we work towards, but we really try to come up with practical solutions. And then we resolve, hopefully, which is the advocating to have those other new ways of doing things that might be more protective of people's rights implemented. So that's the advocacy side. We've worked with many different governments, right? Republican, Democrat, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, what have you, Obama. And for the most part, when implementing immigration policy, the administrations that we've worked with have been not always following policy that we would recommend or that we like, but the objective is to enforce the law. The objective has been to, create order, implement the laws that the administration's been given by Congress to implement, right? And over time, we've seen more and more of a focus on border security, over protection, over other aspects of immigration. And I think that, that did not start with this administration. But what I've really seen as a shift in this administration is an actual deliberate objective of undermining the law, of manipulating the law in order to make the law do the opposite of what it was intended to do. And both Alberto and Royce have talked about various examples of how that has been done, right? But we've seen, for example, with the AB case and the access to asylum, it's this undermining and actually looking at previous cases, reinterpreting language and saying private acts don't qualify as persecution, and claiming that that's what the law says, like going back to the INA and sort of trying to quote certain pieces of the law out of context to say they mean something they don't mean. And when you look at the entire context of the law, it's very clear that that's not what they mean. So while asylum law, references government actors, it also allows very specifically for non-government actors, right? So to say that because it's a private act, domestic violence or gang violence that isn't implemented by a government doesn't qualify is a clear contradiction with what the law actually says. We see it also with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which protects unaccompanied children, specifically intended to protect unaccompanied children from trafficking. And this administration has undergone practices that counter what is written in the TVPRA with their stated objective of protecting children from trafficking, whereas the actual objective is undermining the law created to protect children from trafficking and thereby actually putting them at more risk of trafficking. And they do this over and over and over again. And that makes it, I think, really difficult in some ways. In some ways, it hands legal litigation right to you, right? I mean, I think from the moment the administration came in and started creating executive orders and instituting policy, it's as though on a daily basis you have 10, new projects laid out before you, almost with the playbook of how to do it. And the problem is, how do you get to all of it? And how do you fight that in a context of an administration that is not playing by the rules, right? Their rules are to undermine the rules. And so it creates a real challenge, I think, for people doing both legal work and policy work. So having said all of that, I mean, I think my piece of this really is the focus on women and children and vulnerable populations, which have been, oddly, again, this administration's primary target. In almost every policy that they've implemented, they seem to focus and go for the most vulnerable portion of the population that could possibly be affected by their policies. They've gone after women. They've gone after women domestic violence survivors. They go after unaccompanied children. They go after people who may not have the means to prove that they're going to be wealthy when they get here. In every case, over and over again, it's going for the most vulnerable. So having said that, asylum seekers are one of those categories. Royce really laid out one of the major issues we're seeing with asylum, I mean, both the access to different kinds of asylum by certain populations and turning away people at the border. These again, are not just violations of US law, but really clear violations of international law. Again, in this context, this administration doesn't care about international law. And in fact, almost intentionally violates international law in order to prove their point that they don't need to follow other people's rules. So it's yet another way in which they're really intentionally manipulating or just blatantly violating law and almost saying, we dare you to do something about it. So it leaves a lot of work for future attorneys. There's going to be a lot of cleanup to everything that we're seeing here, just in terms of straight out rule of law. In addition to the sort of turning back people at the border, right, we've seen, and you've all heard about the family separation, so obviously I'm sure you're all expecting me to talk about it. Family separation at the border is something that we had been seeing for years. So again, not something exclusive to this administration, but an issue that this administration took to a much more extreme, much further, and took that extra step, as I mentioned, of manipulating the law, manipulating current policies, current settlement agreements, current law, current practice, in order to undermine that rule of law and the intent of those laws and deter people from seeking asylum. So again, it goes back to this issue of asylum and trying to keep people from coming to the United States and exercising their rights to protection. It was very clear from the get-go that this administration was thinking about and considering separating families as a way to deter families from coming to the United States. They said this in public statements. Secretary Kelly said it within weeks of the administration coming into office when he was Secretary of Homeland Security. He retracted it a bit after public pressure and started using slightly different words because I think he realized that the actual words in order to deter were very blatantly illegal. But again, what we see from some of the policymakers in the administration is that they don't care. That's actually what they want to have out there because they let that slip over and over and over again, that the intent was to deter. So we were seeing a buildup on family separation as a policy for a long time, even though from what we knew, they hadn't instituted a formal policy of separation until I think they finally found sort of the mechanism through which they wanted to do that after already separating hundreds and hundreds of families at the border simply through an unannounced policy of separation. they began with what is known as zero tolerance. And that was when the Attorney General announced that they would be prosecuting anybody who crossed into the United States without authorization. And again, in this sort of ignoring of or deliberately ignoring existing law, they implemented this policy even with asylum seekers, right? So with asylum seekers, you have this sort of vague area. Clearly the law has a certain, if you look at it, it's very clear that asylum seekers, you have the right to seek asylum, right? So even if you come into, no matter how you come into the country, and the law states this very clearly, regardless of how you've entered the country, you have the right to seek asylum. But the administration really focused on that crossing without authorization. And you already heard from Royce how they were driving people away from ports of entry already, right? We'd already been hearing about people being turned away at ports of entry, told in various ways that this was no longer the way you could come into the United States. And so when they came in another way, they were then immediately prosecuted. I should add also that families were being separated even at ports of entry before this, right? So many families seeking asylum were being told that if they insisted on seeking asylum in this country, the result would be that they would be separated and they would be held in detention separate from their children while that application went through. And those officials were also very diligent in informing people that there's a big backlog, and so you're going to be sitting in asylum, you're going to be sitting in detention for 8 months to a year without your child while you seek asylum. It's not a surprise that many families said, you know what, it's okay, I'll go back. And we have some cases of families who indeed did that and have now, petitioned to try to come back into the United States. And others who are so traumatized by their experience, they're still sitting in hiding in Mexico, trying to figure out what to do. And as Royce mentioned, there is litigation now pending on these turn-back policies. But it's very closely tied to the family separation policy. So what was the trick with the zero tolerance? What we were seeing was that families were being prosecuted, parents were being prosecuted for entering or re-entering, sent to criminal courts for the case to be determined. And in the meantime, the excuse was, well, we have no choice but to separate families because obviously we can't send a child through the criminal court process. At the same time, what the administration was trying to do was undermine what they had already started a campaign against, which was the Flores Settlement Agreement, which provides key protections for children and the conditions in which they're detained, and that includes children who are accompanied and who are not accompanied. So the administration was really trying to get around, again, previous existing law that said there's a limit to how long you can, and in what conditions, you can hold a family who has children with them. And also, at the same time, trying to say that the Flores settlement, this longstanding settlement agreement between the government and plaintiffs who filed suit based on really horrific conditions in which children were being held prior to the settlement agreement, and say that that agreement was impossible to comply with and that it had to be modified. And that, in fact, it was causing children and parents to make this really dangerous journey and put themselves at the hands of traffickers. So again, they were twisting around law that was created to protect children, to say if you're going to have children in custody, it has to be under established child welfare standards. You have to give them food and water, and you can't house them with criminals, and you have to provide them with recreation and with school, really basic child welfare principles. And saying those are too difficult to meet, and they're leading us to be a country where people are coming to try to take advantage of us because they're people who take advantage. They're not people seeking protection. They're not people who build a country. They're people who are using us. Again, reinforcing all of those messages. So I've gone about this a little bit confusingly, but these cases are all intertwined. So what you saw is the Ms. L case filed by the ACLU, mind you, before zero tolerance was put into effect. So the Ms. L case is litigation based on the practice of separating families at the border. It includes families, it became a class action, and includes families separated at ports of entry and families between ports of entry, right? That built up a lot of public outrage, especially when we saw zero tolerance and you saw kids in cages. And you guys all saw all of that in the news, so I'm not going to go into the details of that. But what I do want to point out is that the public outrage there had a large effect on the outcome of that litigation. It was really, really clear, and even stated by the court in the judge's decision, that the response from the public made it clear that the practice was found to be unacceptable by the public, which had value in how that decision was made. And I say that because I think that's going to be really, really important moving forward under this administration. The administration, this is our one victory here, my one happy note. The administration reversed course a little bit, right? They felt the pressure and they said, okay, we didn't really mean that. We're going to find different ways of doing that. And the court actually found that they had to stop separating families. They issued an injunction and an order that families separated thus far had to be reunified. The administration has dragged their feet the whole way, but they're doing it. But they're looking for other ways to get around this order and still be able to deter people from coming to this country. They're still very much focused on this, keep people out, especially the most vulnerable. And so we have now the Flores regs, which I'll touch on briefly. The Flores settlement came out, as I said, of this court case. It was settled in the 90s. In 1996, so it's been around a long time. It's come up several times because it's had to be brought back to court when the government has not complied on several occasions, once with family detention, several times with conditions of custody, especially at the border. And this litigation is still pending. But the administration has finally decided to issue regulations because once regulations are issued, the settlement agreement goes away. The court's jurisdiction over the case goes away. What's really unbelievable, although it shouldn't be unbelievable in the context of this administration, is that the regulations as written, again, just like I've gone over and over again, blatantly contradict what the settlement agreement says and try to circumvent the intent of the agreement. It eliminates primarily licensing requirements for children's facilities and says, we, the government, can self-license. We'll figure out our own licensing. We don't need states to license us, which is clearly not what the court found at the time that they made the agreement, right? Because what had been very clear is that the government was unable to appropriately monitor itself and create standards that were appropriate for children. It does a lot of other things that undermine pieces of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Flores Settlement Agreement that I won't go into a lot now, but overall, it really, in many, many ways, again, undermines existing law. There will certainly be litigation about this because of that. And again, it's going to be dragged out for a long time. So I'm going to leave it there. I mean, all of this, again, the implications for women and for children, as well as for vulnerable populations broadly, are enormous. We've seen, in addition to the difficulties of people accessing the asylum system and even reaching our borders, increases in the risks of people going further underground, both in terms of how they enter the country, right? What we've seen for years is people presenting themselves at ports of entry or crossing the border and actually walking to a port of entry on the US side. Almost everybody I spoke to at the border when I was monitoring the family separation practices, almost every single family, I think I only had one that told me that they didn't walk after crossing the river, walk to the port of entry and turn themselves in. But what we're starting to see is people not doing that, right? People trying to come in more secretively puts them in more danger. And as a government, it's not good for our national security because we don't know who people are, right? They're further in the shadows. They're more susceptible to all sorts of exploitation. I'm going over time, I know. I'm going to wrap up. So it's endangering them more in that respect. We're seeing fewer people come forward, filing domestic violence complaints and other requests for protection from local law enforcement. We're seeing fewer people come forward across the board seeking relief because, again, as Royce pointed out, seeking any sorts of going through a legal process and getting rejected puts you at enormous risk of being in the system and deported as opposed to on a path to legalization. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Before turning to Paulina Vera for some reactions and closing remarks, I just wanted to thank our speakers for giving us clarity, for giving us examples, for really helping us understand a very complicated context. Where there are many issues at play. We're talking about human dignity, we're talking about rule of law, we're talking about international law, we're talking about human rights implications, and we're also talking about vulnerable groups as well. Before I turn to Paulina, I also want to thank the Immigration Law Association, which helped us co-sponsor this event. And after Paulina, we're going to open the floor for some questions.
Thank you, Dean Saloria, for the introduction, and thank you to the panelists for their comments. Like the dean said, my name is Paulina Vera. I'm a proud GW Law alumna and an alum of the clinic as well, and currently the supervising attorney at the GW Law Immigration Clinic, where I work alongside Professor Benitez and many of our student attorneys who are right here in the front row. So because I have the closing remarks, I'm going to try to end on a positive note, but I did want to start out with a quote, so it's kind of eerie how similar we start to think because we work together so much, but I also have a quote to read to all of you. And the quote comes from the Attorney General Jeff Sessions and some remarks that he made to the Executive Office for Immigration Review on October 12th of 2017. The Attorney General stated, "The system is being gamed. The credible fear process was intended to be a lifeline for persons facing serious persecution, but it has become an easy ticket to illegal entry into the United States. We also have dirty immigration lawyers who are encouraging their otherwise unlawfully present clients to make false claims of asylum, providing them with the magic words needed to trigger the credible fear process. We are indeed in extraordinary times where the administration is not only attacking immigrant communities, but also attacking the immigration bar who defends them and the lawful processes that allow for people to seek refuge in our country. Many people are suffering and will continue to suffer as a result of these attacks. However, if you leave with anything today, it should be that practitioners, law students, and concerned citizens alike should not despair, because that ultimately does not serve anyone. I would like to emphasize, we are going to get through this. And that is because all of us here today believe in a humane and rational immigration policy that falls on the right side of history and reason. So what is it that you could and should be doing? Well, you've already taken the first step by being here today, by listening to the panelists when you could be anywhere else on a Tuesday afternoon. Like Professor Benitez pointed out, vote. 34 days, November is right around the corner. And not only should you vote, but you should know who it is that you're voting for, and you should be holding those people accountable. Donate to any of the wonderful organizations that are represented on this panel today, or the many more that exist nationwide. As someone who comes from a nonprofit background, I used to work at Casa de Maryland before I came to the clinic. I know how strapped for resources some of these organizations can be, so let's help them continue to do the good work that they've been doing. Also, take care of yourselves, emotionally and physically. You can't help others if you don't help yourself first. Finally, when it comes time for you to practice, as I know we have many law students in the room today, represent people. Even if you don't decide to practice immigration law, there's always a need for pro bono attorneys. Don't think that you can't do anything just because you may not be working on immigration issues to the extent that I am or that the panelists here are today. What I've been most impressed with in this moment in history is the way the immigration advocacy community, organizers, law students, legal assistants, attorneys, etc., have come together and mobilized to respond to the constant, sometimes daily, policy changes and case law. Because of their efforts and the work that the clinic does, I have been better able to loop in others, such as my classmates, shout out to class of 2015, or to all of you today, who want to help out with immigration issues. Because of their efforts, I've also been able to provide the best representation that I can to my clients. And because of their efforts, Mr. Sessions, I'm proud to be a dirty immigration attorney. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We all needed that. Any questions on the floor? Or any comments?
A comment, I guess. But thank you to all of you for your presentation. I mean, definitely the panorama is not but it's good that we try to sort of also have the silver lining about, people who care about this. I mean, one of the things that Michelle mentioned that, I care a lot, I volunteer about, on that is the vulnerability that these people are put in terms of being, potential victims of trafficking in person, or human trafficking. And how is that being, addressed, and also in terms of representation, because I really probably have an interest, I have to disclaimer. We did some volunteer work, at the border, and there are people who need representation. So at some point, maybe partnering or doing something together with pro bono, attorneys would be a good thing. But the question also would be, what are we doing in terms of, highlighting this vulnerability of these people being victims of human trafficking, and how bad and pervasive is that nowadays,
So the trafficking question has always been a real challenge. From the beginning of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, there's been debate about how much trafficking there actually is, and how do you count that, and how do you figure it out? Because the reality is that we don't know until it's too late, usually. So estimates are made on, survivors, people who are found and somehow get out of that situation, and then extrapolated from there, and it's tricky. I say that it's increasing based on a few separate things. One, I think what we're seeing at the border is a return to practices and sort of ways of coming into the country that we had seen fade away, right? That we specifically created provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to address. And what we're seeing is exactly what you would expect when you take away those protections, or call them loopholes, and make them less available. So, for example, we've seen an increase in sex work at the border with women who are migrants who've come through Mexico, and then because the rates for crossing the border have become higher because of difficulties, because they can no longer present at a port of entry, they are having to raise more money to find other ways of getting across. What we used to see quite often is that women and children, especially women with children, but very often women and or children, came through ports of entry more frequently than non-women and children. So sometimes also through not clear presentation, right? So sometimes with false documents in other ways, but that was a more common way of entering because it was safer. It is no longer safer or no longer an option. So very clearly we're seeing people coming more between the ports of entry. The other thing we've seen an increase in, and which we've heard less about in the news, but for a little while there was a spike in it, but if you talk to people at the border, there's been a clear spike, is people coming in these dangerous, so it's like in containers, in the back of trucks, in the trunk of cars. So as an example, based on news reports and just general word of mouth, we were hearing that these had increased, right? But I specifically asked at the port of entry in San Isidro, and before I even finished my sentence, the head of the port of entry said to me, "Oh, we've seen an enormous increase. So much so that they now have emergency personnel stationed 24 hours a day at the port of entry because they find people in trunks of cars, in the back of trunks, who are already on the verge of death, right? They need to be rushed to hospitals because they find them at that point." So all of this, I think, makes it, not too big a leap to assume that there are more people actually being brought in who make it through, but then are in these difficult situations. The other piece that we used to see a lot that I've started to hear hints of is this, "Oh, you don't have money to get in. That's okay. You can work it off once we get there." We see that with both women and children. We used to see it more. honestly, whether it just wasn't coming to our attention or not, it did seem to have gone down, and now we're starting to see increases. But I don't think we're going to have evidence of increase until people actually start getting, quote, rescued, right? And that depends on a lot of different pieces, which are becoming more difficult because, again, if you're afraid to go to the authorities, it's harder to get away from one of those situations. And I should just say that when I'm talking about this stuff, I'm not just talking about sex trafficking. A lot of what we're seeing is really labor trafficking.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for a very illuminating panel. My name is Lachinti Uthanage. I'm an environmental law and energy program fellow here. And so this is very illuminating for me because it's completely outside my area. What kind of struck me was just how many parallels there are in terms of what we're experiencing with the undermining of law in particular. And I like the idea of looking forward and this concept and what you were talking about, Professor Benitez, in terms of looking forward into what's going to happen at the next election and then thereafter. So let's say we have the bright scenario that things change. Considering all these options where we have so many avenues for undermining the law, what is something that each of you would put forward as this is the way that we could make sure that such undermining doesn't happen again in the future?
This will continue to happen if people who are in power now continue to get voted in, because there's a lot of discretion, there's that word, in enacting a law that was the law when Barack Obama was president. I remind you, there's been no legal change, there's been no amendment to the law. And that's something that Paulina and I get a lot of, because Paulina and I do direct representation. So we go to the immigration court in Crystal City, we go to the asylum office at 7:30 in the morning in Roslyn, we go to the USCIS office over in Dunloring. That's what we do on a daily basis. And we get a lot of questions from people who say, well, what is the law? How has the law changed? The law has not changed. What has changed is who's enforcing the law. None of the things that my fellow panelists have talked about today had to happen. There was nothing that required it from happening. Nothing. It wasn't happening on January 19th, 2017. What made it so necessary on January 20th, 2017? It's who's enforcing the law. So I want to piggyback on something that Paulina said, which is know who you're voting for and hold those people accountable, because depending on your perspective, one party could change things, but will they? Or if they happen to be elected to office, will they then say, well, we need to sort of be bipartisan and we need to not really push this? People are dying. Children are being incarcerated. It's not an esoteric, theoretical issue here that we can sort of talk about and maybe write a law review article about. These are real people who are really dying every day, and there's absolutely no reason for it. None whatsoever.
It's hard to limit myself to only one suggestion, so I may name just a couple. So I think Congress needs to use the power of the purse. They fund the government agencies, and they can withhold funding from the agencies for practices that they find problematic. So if they don't like the fact that there are a record number of adults in detention, for example, then they should neither provide the funding for ICE to do that, or where ICE is overrunning its budget, which is what it's doing now, when ICE comes looking for additionals like supplemental funding, deny that request so they learn to live within their means. That's one example of a number of different ways where they could use their funding authority. Even if they can't come to consensus around various immigration reforms, the funding has to continue. And that's sort of, with the exception of the possibility of a short government shutdown, as a general matter, the funding has to continue, and that's a great authority that Congress has the ability to use to be a check on the system. As a practical matter, and we mentioned a little bit at the outset changes to how the immigration courts are operating, and then certainly the Attorney General's decision in matter of AB. If the immigration courts were Article I courts under the Constitution, which would make them independent courts and not administrative courts of the Department of Justice, they would be able to provide a measure of independent decision-making and not be subjected to the political whims of any administration. Which right now, I mean, the Attorney General has made very clear and very explicitly, I mean, it's very much on the record where he has said to the immigration judges, you are my employee and you will do as I say. I mean, I'm virtually not paraphrasing. And most courts don't operate that way. And so the tax courts are another model where it's a congressionally created Article I court to allow for that independence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the court piece. That piece is really critical. I would extend it even beyond immigration court, right? To say, I mean, not the Article I piece, but I mean, I think so much is riding on having some kind of accountability for what's happening. You know, I think what everybody's afraid of is they're doing things that are very clearly violations of the law as written. And so far it's been hard to sort of stop them. Right? So I think we need to figure out how to make the court system continue to work. I mean, so far the court has been our savior, but it feels precarious, right? So I think strengthening that is going to be really important, the independence of the courts. And just general stepping up. I mean, I think Professor Benitez also pointed out a really important piece, which is, you know, I've spoken to a lot of people from the Obama administration who, again, we criticize kind of a lot at the Women's Refugee Commission. So it's not like they, you know, we're working perfectly. But many of them have said to me, we work too slowly. We were too concerned about what the other side thought. We were too slow. We thought we had plenty of time, and we should have acted more quickly. And so I would hope that if we're in a place where we can have accountability, that moves more quickly, and that procedures and policies are put in place so that they can have more legs and be more entrenched, right? And in that, I would say if we can move somewhere towards getting attorneys for people going through the immigration process, it would make a world of difference.
Thank you. My thanks to the panel, to the moderator for great information. My question is what your view is of accredited representatives and whether there's a role for law schools in training, in addition to preparing attorneys, but in trying to create more of a structure for training accredited representatives.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think that law schools can play a great role in representing non-citizens. Immigration clinics are expensive. They're expensive because of the interpreter-translator issue. And we in the immigration clinic have always insisted on a policy of not having family or friends acting as interpreters or translators. For many reasons, starting off with the common sense is that you don't want a 14-year-old son interpreting how his mother was gang raped in El Salvador. But that's expensive. I say freely and openly that GW is wonderful in that respect. It's expensive, but I think it's worth the effort, and there are people at the law school who traditionally have felt that it's an important thing to do, and that's what the student attorneys do. Accredited representatives. You know, there are paralegals and accredited representatives that know way more immigration law than any immigration attorney out there. So a message to all you law students out there, when you become a lawyer, you start working at a firm, be nice to your secretaries and your paralegals, because they'll know way more about whatever it is that you're doing than you do. And they can make your life very easy, and they can make your life very difficult, as they should, because they are professionals doing the work that you are doing. I think we can all agree that, as one of my colleagues just said, the need for representation in removal proceedings or at affirmative asylum interviews is critical. And as someone once said, and someone said during this panel, is non-citizens can obtain representation in removal proceedings, say, at no cost to the government. But in removal proceedings, the government is always represented by government-provided representatives. They never, ICE never goes unrepresented in a removal proceeding. And that sort of imbalance is very unfair. Anyone who hasn't seen a removal proceeding where someone is pro se, trying to make his or her case, really should. Or an affirmative asylum interview, that's harder to see, but watching an experienced attorney go up against someone who's pro se, who doesn't speak the language, is painful and should not be happening in this country.
I was only going to add ditto to everything you just said. The rate of representation for at least the detained population is 14%. And that means that not only is a case harder to make from detention, where you don't have the support of your family, you don't have access to your documents, it's harder to have access to the phone, to build your case, to pull witnesses together, et cetera, to support an asylum case, for example. But your access to an attorney who can help you understand what your rights are, what your eligibility may or may not be, is critical. And we know also that once you're represented, your rates of success skyrocket dramatically. So getting various forms of representation is critical. And I would just do a personal plug, organizational plug. We have launched something called the Immigration Justice Campaign in conjunction with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and I have some flyers here, which is an effort to get more pro bono representation to detained individuals around the country. There is a role for lawyers, obviously, but also for others to support the campaign, interpreters being a big one, because a lot of attorneys are willing to provide pro bono services but don't speak the language. It's not just Spanish, certainly heavily Spanish, but there's a need for a wide range of languages. So if you're interested in learning more about what law students can do and how to enroll and get updates, I'm happy to share this. You can also go to the website, which is immigrationjustice.us.
And I will just briefly add that in my time many years ago clerking with an immigration court, the representation provided by law students who were going through a clinic was no question far superior on average than the overall representation of the people that came before the court. And so there's an enormous amount of respect, I think, in immigration courtrooms for law students and clinics, and the work is critical in training immigration attorneys and getting more representation to really vulnerable population.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a GW student, an international student, and thank you for a very informative and interesting panel. I wanted to ask about maybe to kind of zoom out to the more international scenery, both to recognize that this anti-immigrants trend is happening elsewhere in the world. And I'm not sure I understand completely the reasons, but there is kind of a very similar occurrences in different parts of the world. And if you have any insights of why that is happening, not only because obviously the thrust of immigration that has increased dramatically over the past few years, but how is it or why is it that that leaders and politicians are using or abusing this in order to gain political force? And if you have any experience or thoughts of how to use that in order to maybe build some cooperation throughout in different countries to use because of these similar trends and experiences, if immigration NGOs and clinics, how is it possible to use this momentum to reinforce each other's work in different parts?
I actually, if I could, I'd just start off. I do have some personal experience with being the other in many, many contexts in this country growing up. You can't grow up in this country being other than a white male and not at some point in your life have been treated as the other. Nothing that is going on now, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, is new. There's nothing new about this. What is different now is that it's sort of given free flow, because words matter, and when words come from the White House, people who may have had those views, and everyone is entitled to hateful views, but not everyone is entitled to sort of inflict them on someone else. I don't want to hear them. I'm not interested in hearing them. But it is a fact that people feel empowered to separate us and them. Second, it's always been a winning political formula to divide people into us and them. They're not like us. They're different. They're infesting this country. They're bringing disease. They're bringing things. And we're seeing this happen, I believe, in countries that, Sweden and, the Netherlands and other countries like this. And I'm going to say something very controversial here, and I might get booted out of this room for saying it. I actually don't believe that people like the current president and others who say these things maybe even necessarily believe them. But there's a word in Spanish, it's cynical in English, but in Spanish it's cínico, and it's always someone like sort of knowingly using something to get ahead, knowing that it's not even true, but I'm going to use it. And you have a lot of politicians in a lot of parts of the world who are using this, and sadly, successfully, sadly. How do you counteract it? By doing what we've been talking about right here. Not, we're going to get over this. We're going to win in the long run, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I suppose I would only build on that to say, I think there are a lot of global forces at play. That globalism means that the economic opportunities shift for people, and people are introduced to new people. That societies become more heterogeneous by virtue of that mobility. On that latter point, it can be scary for people, and so it's just easy to, and this is not a new, as you say, is not a new phenomenon, but I think the pace at which a lot of cultures are being exposed to new populations makes it ripe for this sort of resurgence of it right now. On the economic front, I think it is much easier to say to someone, it must be the low-wage immigrants who took your jobs and not the forces of a global economy where we need you to have new skills that you don't yet have because our society hasn't caught up to provide you with the skills that are needed in a modern economy. So that scapegoating is just easier than really tackling the forces at play. I forgot my second point, so I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Jump in after me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, everything they said, I'm not going to even start to try to guess at what's led to some of the situations we're in and to the magnitude that we're in there now. But I will say that there, the parallels, I think, also are somewhat of an east-west issue or north-south issue as well, right? So I think what we've really seen in the last 5 years, maybe, or more, is, and again, this is pre-Trump, is a shift. It's almost as though the globalization wasn't ready to take on the globalization of people, right? It was economically, yes, goods, yes, but the people part, no. And we are at a point in which the number of refugees in the world is at its highest point ever. Migration and refugee issues have been an issue since the beginning of time, right? I mean, they're biblical. But I think what we're really seeing now is the North sort of saying, you know what, refugees are okay when there's 2 million of them in Jordan. But when they start coming to our shores, it's a problem. And I think the U.S. is in the same boat. It's like they were okay when there weren't that many, when they were down there and we were making somebody else take on that burden. But now we're not so into it. And there's an ability now, whether it's just that it was just discovered or somebody decided to implement it, of pushing borders away from industrialized and developed countries, right? So we saw it with, paying Turkey to take refugees, pushing borders south, providing financial and political incentives, and we see the same exact thing in the United States regionally. We see the Plan for Prosperity. We see, telling Central American countries that they will get economic support to address their root causes, but only if they're able to prevent their citizens from leaving or coming to the United States. We see paying Mexico to take on deportation, and now talk of safe third countries. So I think that's something that's happening worldwide as well, and we see it in Australia. Why? I'm not exactly sure, but it's definitely a global issue.
I remember my other point, which just very quickly is that I think we've ceded our moral leadership on welcoming the persecuted, and we would be naive not to think that other countries are taking cues from us. There is in our leadership role, it's a prompt for burden sharing or benefit sharing, depending on how you want to look at, responsibility sharing. Thank you, that's a better term. That if we do our part, others will do their part. But where we say, no thank you, then other countries, we'd love to think that other countries will step into the void. And sure, there may be times where Canada will say, sure, refugees come here, but as a general rule, other countries are going to say, oh, that's not, we don't have that responsibility. That's not a thing anymore. So I think we can't overlook the role we play in leading others to follow suit.
I think there's another comment over here. A question over there, back there. Yes, thank you.
Sure. So my question kind of follows from that of the previous speaker in a way, and it's there's a lot of huge and critical battles being fought in the courts, the actual courts. But the one that always seems to me that's maybe missing or hidden is the court of public opinion and the apparent acceptance of this perception of the migrant and difference between citizens and non-citizens that allowed this administration and all these policies to come to power and for it to continue to enjoy a lot of support in this country. And so to that, my question is, are you guys aware of organizations that are doing work on that front, more about kind of a public relations type work on behalf of migrants, on behalf of refugees, to kind of paint a different picture to counter the narrative that's been pushed by this administration and others?
So I can preview for you basically an effort that we have underway at the American Immigration Council in partnership with Welcoming America to basically do a public service announcement type campaign that focuses on sort of our core values of welcoming and respecting your neighbor, welcoming the stranger, that kind of a, where it's not, we know that words like immigrant are already a triggering word, so sort of even taking it back a notch so that we're not provoking a difficult conversation from the moment the words are said, but rather looking at sort of the core underlying values we can agree upon and how we treat other people, whether they're new to us or familiar to us. So I guess stay tuned on that front. We're actively working on it. It just hasn't launched yet.
We have this effort here. My concern has always been not so much as is anyone getting a message out there, but who's receiving the message. One of the things that I think is something that doesn't work well is that we tend to talk to each other. And those of you who are here I'm assuming, are here because you believe in a fair and humane and rational humane policy. There are others who want to kick everybody out, detain them, and lock the door and go into and get 12 million people and put them on trucks and buses and get them out of here. I've always been interested in the middle people, the people who don't know non-citizens, people who may live in sort of homogenous sort of places where it's not really an issue unless and until it happens to somebody that they know. If it's their babysitter who has an immigration problem, then they come run into people like us and say, why is this happening to Maria? She's lovely and she's good with the kids. They love her. And I would say, well, who did you vote for last? Oh, I don't know who I voted for last. I didn't vote. I was too busy. Well, it's like, well, you know, there's 12 million Marias and Juans, but you're just interested in this because it happens to suit you personally. I mean, we have a potential client coming into to the office in the next few days who wants to know, how can they deport my spouse? I'm a United States citizen. Well, they'll deport your spouse and they won't think twice about it just because you're married to he or she is married to you. So if there was some way, and this is something that I don't do policy work, I do direct representation. But what I've always found is there some way to get to people in the suburbs of Dubuque, Iowa, and get them to understand this? My wife is from a city in Wisconsin called Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Not too many people look like me in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So I always feel and felt kind of out of place when I go there because there's not too many of me there. I would like to educate people like that in sort of these issues that we're talking about and get them to at least consider the possibility that they can maybe shift the way they view the world and that non-citizens are not a threat to them in any way. And that's a hard thing to do because I know what I know is I know what I know, and I watch it on Fox News and MS-13 and Manas and stuff, and so that's sort of my struggle. How can we get the information to the people in the middle who may have goodwill but just are not educated? The people are the deplorables. I think they're sort of, they're gone. I mean, you're never going to get them. Whatever's going on now is too liberal for them. I mean, this is like, we're being too soft. You can't really talk with people like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the key and sort of what AIC is trying to get at in some ways with this campaign, right? Is how do you get people to see this population as people, right? As their neighbors, as their friends, as their kid's soccer coach, as their babysitter, as their child's teacher, as, you know, I mean, people. And I think to maybe end this on a more positive note than I usually do, I think that in some ways the family separation, I hate calling it a crisis because the administration created it, right? But the crisis of the government doing it, not the crisis of people coming, sort of was a wake-up call to people. And I think something about the way it was phrased, right? As children being taken away from parents, not immigrants being taken away from immigrant parents or whatever, but children, right? And everybody somehow could identify with this concept of, oh my God, if my child was taken away, I'd freak out, or vice versa, if I had been taken away from my mother, right? And it took off like wildfire for whatever reason, right? It captured people in their hearts in that way. It was a big victory, I think, in that sense. I think it actually really opened up a lot of people's hearts, really, to think of immigrants and the administration's attack on them in a very different way. And we saw a lot of action from people who normally do not participate. So the kinds of people that participated in the March on Family Separation, that emailed, that wrote to us, that, you know, got involved and donated and all sorts of things, were not really an overlap with traditional populations that care about immigration. It really went way beyond that, and it made a big difference. I'm not saying we're going to keep all of those people engaged, but I think that they're now aware at a level that they weren't. I think the administration overplayed their hand a bit, and in some ways it was almost helpful, not for the thousands of kids that suffered as a result, but in the long run, in terms of opening people up to how cruel the anti-approach can be, right? And so I think we need to build on that and keep that population engaged. And as you know, somebody said recently in a thing, it's like we need to just be careful that in trying to speak to the woke, we don't alienate the waking, right? So we want to keep those folks who are seeing this is just not right, but get them to be open to hearing more about what we're talking about. So I think that there's a real opening right now. I think that happened from day one with this administration, that people were paying more attention. and I think we need to take advantage of it.
Well, I think we have reached the ending of our panel, and I just wanted to say, before we thank our speakers, that it's really important to keep the hope alive, especially in the most complex and difficult times. This is something that I always share with my students. It's important to stay engaged. You are obtaining law degrees, most of you, and that is a very important tool, as exemplified by many of the practitioners who are sitting in this table, who are working daily to address these very complicated issues. You're going to have an incredible tool to be able to do that. And thank you for joining us in the discussion today. For me, it's very encouraging to see as many of you here as we have seen today. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers. And thank you to the Immigration Law Association for co-sponsoring.
Great, thank you. I don't have, I'll email you. I never carry my card.
Want to carry my bag around, makes it easy.
Cool.
No, I was going to say, I didn't have a chance to talk to
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I have to jump on a call.
Actually interned at the council.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Say hi to,
Yeah, it's good to keep it in the, stay in the
Yeah.
community.
say hi to Josh.
Oh, you know.
So the bad news for me, good news for him, is he is going to be counsel for the House Immigration in 2 weeks.
Good news for all of us, really,
It is,
given.
no, it is good news for everybody. It's a bit of a hole in my team, so I'm going to have to find an ample replacement.
Do you work with Jason Blake?
Yes, he said we were on this panel together, and you know, Ayla and the council being in the same building and meetings together. Jason flagged for me.
Cool. Please give him my regards.
I will. And if you think your students would be interested, if you want to take any of these back to the clinic, you know, that'd be 100 of them. But some,
Are you going up to the place?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think I'm going to give you a couple. There we go. Thank you both.
Good meeting you. Hope to see you again real
Likewise.
soon.
That would be great. Nice to meet you. Take care. Nice to meet you too.
She wants to introduce us.
Luis.
Hi. Oh, my pleasure. Please, if you can send them in, you can actually sign up for, you can sort of explain your skill set, because we do love to know people's foreign language skills, because, you know, Spanish is almost the easiest language for us to find interpreters for, but Farsi is much harder, of course. So that would be wonderful, please.
So when I talked about it, he's like, happy note, happy note. I was like, what do I make this happy? Yeah.
So a lot of it's done remotely because people are detained around the country, and we partner organizations who work on the ground with detainees in Texas, Colorado, Washington State, New Jersey. So it can vary, but a lot of it can be done telephonically, where you know an attorney is on the phone with a client and needs someone to help interpret. So it's actually quite good for law schools who may not be mobile but have the skill set. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mi pregunta es cuántos novios salió para llenar el
Share experiences. Best practice, maybe have a quiet behind closed
No, I have to go to,
put it on the table.
queda un montón, porque queda un montón de gente que no son detenidos. Así que sí, pueden seguir que el dinero está ahí, por eso es que por eso es con el appropriations, tenemos que decir que eso diga basta, ya hay un límite. Es que tengo que ponerte otra llamada, por eso hablamos. Argentino, mi padre es argentino. Sí.
So, since there may be some room for some redirection of some of the
in addition to tying in Murphy, Sean Murphy, however we can, rather than just have speeches and great addresses and sit in rooms and have great thoughts and have your chest, have your heart race, but in the end, it's very hard to see where does that go, right? So I was mentioning this to Rosa, and she said, well, the logical next step is to talk to her colleagues here. So she invited me today, which is great. Appreciative of. And I would just like to flesh out the idea, because I do agree with you, the whole siloing problem, that people operate in their own silos. I don't know if you saw, but Migration Policy Institute in Georgetown had their big conference yesterday, and there was a very long-term Republican sitting in sessions who gave a lot of perspective going back 10 more years on immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, what happened, what didn't happen. Eventually, all of these panels devolved into Republicans and Democrats taking each other on. I mean, that's just sort of what happens, especially in your months of October and November, likelier. But I really just want to encourage and prompt whether there might be something that you being here in DC can kind of give to them as a space for thinking or a space for whatever it is, given all that they've been through, right? Ever since, let's say, Trump took office. And then also get sort of some of the people in Washington to be more aware of those schools that are truly, the frontline schools. So
the answer is yes. There's no reason why it couldn't be done. It would be very interesting. I don't practice on the border, never have. So there's a whole host of issues on the border that we never deal with, and the people at the border who haven't practiced up here have never encountered issues that we encounter up here. And there are many, especially with juvenile and sort of things. So yes, the answer is yes. Getting it done, I don't know, you, I guess?
That would be with us. Yeah. That would help. Like knowledge transfer within the states. That would be
maybe our perspective on this is, very personal perspective, is that it's already been talked out. And there are people who think better than us. What I think has to be done is actually start representing these people in all the various immigration-related things that come up. Because it's not just asylum, it's not just immigration court. You have a lot of abused, neglected, and abandoned children that need representation in state court to get these SIJ, Special Immigrant Juvenile Orders. Someone mentioned, we need people to represent non-citizens. We need bodies. Anyone that goes to immigration court and watches the numbers of pro se people there, it's heartbreaking. And we're on the list. We take a lot of these clients, but there's no way we can take anywhere near the number of people. There's good-hearted pro bono people, but there's just nowhere near enough. So if there could be more lawyers or law students or accredited representatives, someone talked about accredited representatives.
Let's run it with that. I was telling Rosa, I would like to talk to you.
Have you met
Hi, Michelle Manette.
She's the person of the
Alberto Lisa, nice to meet you.
Association.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was talking to Rosa because this is very important and there's a lot that can be done. And I would like to really, I believe in the power of networks, and partnerships and doing things together because that sort of, elevates the possibilities of what we can do in the world. And I was thinking like the current president of the DC Bar, in the first presentation with the voluntary bar leadership group, expressed her interest on, strengthening the pro bono work of the DC Bar. And we as the Inter-American Bar Association DC chapter would like to do the same and help in that effort. And I'm thinking, if we do a really collective effort among the law school clinics, when you said about this,
maybe it's focusing on them in this greater area. I don't know, but it just seems to me that at least having a way to have conversations with people there, say, there's interest. How can we help you? Right? And maybe they say, all we need are bodies or training maybe they can't think beyond that. And
Yeah,
that's entirely possible.
But we can sort of establish a sort of alliance for this purpose. And I think that individual attorneys who are willing to do pro bono work will be a lot more motivated if they have sort of this alliance, backup, recognition, and everything. Because it happens to a lot of people that they would like to help, but they feel like I'm not an expert on this or that. You know, I mean.
Well, that's where we can help, where our expertise is I mean, we train young law students who don't know anything about anything. Having gone to law school, you don't know anything about anything. Right, exactly.
But maybe just, you know, in the alliance, you could do a system that is something that motivates them. So that, let's say we publish requests for lawsuit, we need volunteers for representing the cases, and then sort of recognition, you know, event at the end, whatever certain period or things like that to really motivate them. So I'm really invested in that. If you like to work on that, I would be very happy, and I can talk with people at Georgetown and DMU and other universities to do that together. You know, Howard, you name it. We can put everyone on the full and that.
The one thing I do caution is they need supervision.
Definitely.
You can't have 50 law students who have the best of intentions doing interviews and trying to represent people. You can't do that. And that's why our job is very labor intensive, because it's very focused on, you don't really know what you're doing because you don't. So we have to walk you through. But it can be done. If people are willing, it can be done, but it just involves labor and it involves some money for the interpreters and translators. Virtually everything else you can get pro bono, free or low cost. But those are the two things, the supervision and the interpreter translation.
I think something that could be interesting too is getting, because there's a lot of client representation, right? That's kind of the clinical level, but we also have a lot of policy think tanks that are working on migration issues. So it'll be cool to get them together and to talk.
Like these.
Yeah, I mean, so it would really shock me if nobody thinks about these things.
Yeah.
I mean,
the thing is implementing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is, meaning we can talk about that, we can think about that, but we agree here, you know, draft a plan, I can put it together, I can talk with people at Georgetown and the other schools. And this is the other thing, we can partner with the language programs, because all these schools are so great that they all have language programs. I'm sure they have a Spanish language program. And then we can try to gather volunteers for the language there. I mean, obviously it has to be a good level, otherwise you need interpret, helping. So you just get the people from the senior year to do like, you know, sort of community hours or whatever they call it.
Yeah, or it's practicum.
Well, you know where we are.
I can work on a concept.
We can work.
Because I think we need something in writing.
Yeah, I mean, the 5 or however many law schools there are, and maybe more.
So let's
And then I also think trying to get the more conservatively identified law schools to at least be aware of this. And I look at Alberto Gonzalez, who's at some law school that is no doubt top-notch, but it's not a top tier. But he's been, you know, pulled out and commenting on things again. You've got to imagine that, you know, he has moments of being illuminated, you know, somewhere in the span of a month, must have a rendezvous with his soul. And so getting them in a non-threatening environment, in a quiet, private, no press, no nothing, just having them, you know, kind of hear the replay of what's been going on. It may take time. It may take a long time. But at least, you know, they're not being cut off or shielded from the reality.
Well,
I think that, I don't know, like GMU is a pretty conservative law school overall, right?
Well, I mean,
Of course.
I think it's a mix. I mean, obviously there has been a big influx of resources from conservative sources, but in theory that shouldn't.
Well, George Washington was a slaveholder, and we don't hold that against him.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think that the spirit of GMU as a school is conservative.
It
There
is.
might be some.
Yeah.
But I don't think the whole spirit.
I don't think it is either.
It is.
Nothing's that simple.
It's very
Yeah,
big,
but the way the
political.
general the general media treats it, it is. It's, you know, yeah.
Well,
And
because they changed
because of
the name,
Scalia's
they
name,
have
and there was quite a
the
controversy.
brothers to mention.
So we will keep in touch.
Yes, we will keep in touch.
Pleasure meeting you.
And we'll
And we'll
Right,
catch up
right.
at this time.
Good.
And when something